Today we're sitting down with Mike Kavanagh. After 18 years of experience as a C-level corporate executive himself, in the past 2 years he's written 3 books. One of them is What is Your Calling? The Journey to Find Your Work and Love. The second one is The Successful Manager, a guide to building and leading high-performing teams. And the third one, an Amazon bestseller, is The Coach's Plan, the personal productivity system that changed his life. Today, Rich and I talk through this coach's plan and the accountability that you can set with yourself to set a plan the night before, take action the following day, get feedback mechanism in place, and repeat. And by doing that on a day-to-day basis, how you can really improve your well-being and self-performance. We look forward to this conversation today with Mike Kavanagh. Mike, welcome to the Entrepreneurs United podcast. I can't wait to learn more about what changed your life. Can you please give us first a quick start? Because I know you work with entrepreneurs and CEOs today, but then I look in your background and you have a PhD in biomedical engineering and neuroscience, and I'm trying to put the pieces together. So can you walk us through a little bit of your background from your past life, if you will, and then we'll dive a little bit more into what you're doing today and how that all came to be.
Yeah, well, I'm still trying to put the pieces together myself, so right there with you.
Awesome.
Yeah, so right now I'm an author, I'm a consultant, I do some coaching, and I focus largely on individual and team well-being and performance. I kind of think of my sweet spot as helping leaders and their teams eliminate overload and stress. How I got here was a bit of a winding road. I originally set down the path of, I was very interested in the brain. And so I was actually on a science path. I was studying neuroscience, on track to get a PhD. I thought maybe I would teach as a college professor, and somewhere along the way realized that the research path wasn't for me. And so I jumped out of there and just started looking for a job and landed at a small management consulting firm that I had no business being hired at, given my complete lack of business experience. But because of the fact that I had some of the science knowledge and they were focused on life sciences companies. Their big clients were large pharma and biotech and medical device companies. Mm-hmm. They took a chance on me, and from that moment on, it was basically zero science. But I was able to be kind of thrust in front of some pretty senior people at a fairly young age, mostly working on growth strategy for these types of companies. And that kind of thus ensued many years in consulting and advising to senior leaders of pretty large companies. And then I kind of jumped ship over and became a corporate executive for a little while, up until a couple of years ago when I set out on my own doing what I'm doing today.
Okay. And when you say a couple of years ago, I mean, we all know what happened a couple of years ago with the COVID pandemic. Was this a cause or effect of that? Or was it you just kind of the timing just coincidentally happened at the same time?
So this was, it was an interesting journey and time for the company. So this was completely separate from COVID.
Okay.
But what happened was our company was originally a part of a public company, and it was being spun off to be its kind of standalone public company, and along the way ended up getting purchased by a private equity firm.
Okay.
And then that private equity company installed their own kind of management team, which I was a part of the existing management team. So I was let go at that point in time. So this was
Gotcha.
late 2019. And then it was kind of like an opportunity to say, all right, what do I want to do now? Because the world is my oyster. I got a lot of time on my hands.
Yeah, that's amazing timing that happened. And then, short few months after that, you're like, what's this COVID thing? And now you're kind of getting starting on your own. So that's kind of an interesting time. I want to learn more. I'm sure Rich does as well, about this productivity system you've come up with. But before we even go there, in order for something to change your life, there needs to be something that needs to be changed. Can you tell us maybe a little bit more of, what in your life at that particular moment you're like, look, I'm going to go do something on my own. I'm going to get out of this corporate space. What was going through your mind, and why was that change needed, I guess, first off?
Yeah. Well, so the first change I will say that had been building for a while for me. So I had often had this itch to do something different. I actually left consulting originally to go be an entrepreneur, and thought I was going to start a business in the fitness space.
Okay.
And And it kind of spent about 6 months going down the path of getting something going, and then just a variety of different factors played out such that I things didn't move quick enough, and I didn't have a long enough runway, and so I had to retrench, and so I ended up finding my way into the fitness industry in a different way, and that's when I ended up taking a job in corporate leadership, and then that ended up lasting quite a bit longer. I was offered some opportunities for larger roles that I was not anticipating, and said yes to a lot of things. And so I always kind of had that in the back of my mind that there were other things that I was interested in, but I kind of rode that journey until its abrupt end. And then when I left, I actually again I had plans to go start a business that looked very different from what I was doing now.
Okay.
I had a kind of a concept for a wellness oriented facility that sort of brought together fitness and some other forms of well-being and recovery into one spot to sort of build a local community and
Sure.
experience around, people who care about kind of physical and mental wellness.
Hmm.
And then that's when COVID hit. And so it was pretty clear that brick and mortar
Yep.
business was not in my future, at least not anytime soon. And so
Hmm.
I kind of had to pivot and say, well, what can I do? Because I still want to be out on my own. And that's when I decided to sort of tie together my background from consulting, as well as all of the things I had built on the side around well-being and performance, and try to tie all this together into something that would, feed me from a just passion standpoint, as well as be something that potentially I could use to for financial sustenance.
Understood. Understood. So when you put together the one of your best-selling books, The Coach's Plan, the personal productivity system that changed my life, before you tell us what that is, what in your life changed by this system?
Yes. Well, so going from, I'll say overnight, from leading an organization of a couple hundred people and to being a one man shop, working from home, kids, I mean, all the COVID challenges, will say that I think
Yep.
everybody had to cope with, as well as for me going from, managing and delegating and the entire kind of mindset that you have as a leader within a larger corporation, to being sort of a jack of all trades,
Hmm.
trying to find your own version of product market fit and figure out exactly what's going to work. All that for me was a very massive change.
Yeah.
And what I found was that a lot of I've always been wired to be a pretty hard worker. I've always thought of myself as quite productive,
Hmm.
but I actually was struggling quite a bit. And I was struggling on many different levels. I would say there was the fact that I could just see that I wasn't quite getting the results that
Yeah.
I needed. I was definitely struggling with just buckling down and doing the hard things. There's a
Yeah.
lot of things that make you uncomfortable, especially when you're starting from scratch, trying to build something new. And so I could tell I would avoid things or put off things that I needed to get done, and I knew that I was doing it, but couldn't quite break out of that habit.
Yeah.
And then I also could see that some of the other more personal well-being oriented things were kind of falling by the wayside too. I wasn't, getting the exercise or the movement that I was used to getting. I wasn't eating as well. I was working very hard, putting a lot of hours in, and not necessarily even taking my own advice that I'd been given to people for years around
Yeah.
kind of carving out space for recharging. So it was almost like the wheels were coming off the bus in many different ways,
Got it.
and it came to a head where I realized, wow, I'm going to run myself into the ground and not get to the goal line if something doesn't change.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like you and I have walked similar paths, and I'll share this with you. In late 2018, beginning of 2019, the a company I co-founded had a private equity group come into it, and one of the first things they did was exit me from the business, and I found
Mm,
myself without calling. I had no idea what I was going to do next. Spent a lot of days doing absolutely nothing, walking the dog, trying to figure out what was going on, and took that time and ultimately found, and you wrote something called "What Is Your Calling: The Journey to Find Work You Love." And I actually spent my whole sabbatical just trying to figure that one out. So I'm very curious as to really some of the tools and lessons you have from that as well. So very very similar journey there. So here
And
you
can
are
I
on the
ask
other
you
side
how?
of it. Sorry.
Sorry, I was curious to hear a little more. And how long was that for you, and how did you kind of turn the corner there?
Yeah. So for me, it was all of 2019 was
Okay, yeah.
I call it a sabbatical, where I was just trying to find myself. Like, what does success look like for me? What am I looking to do? And I talk a lot about it on this with Rich and other guests. What I ultimately found was, what can I be the best in the world at? What can
Mm,
drive my economic engine and what fuels my passion? And what's the Venn diagram? Where does that all meet? And ultimately came down to I want to work with entrepreneurs and I want to help
mm.
entrepreneurs, you know, learn from other entrepreneurs and their successes and failures, including my successes and failures, and help them grow. So that's ultimately where I landed. But it took me a long way to come about it. And I'm very curious to learn more about not only your productivity system, but also, when you wrote "What Is Your Calling," what is the methodology you put together for that? Because that could have maybe helped shave some time off my period there.
Maybe. Yeah, well, it sounds like, I had to, we definitely did walk pretty similar paths, and I had I'll say a similar period of time. It was not too long. And maybe it was a little shorter than that. I think maybe I took 2 to 3 months of just almost doing nothing other than things that were just for enjoyment and reflection. But yeah, the book really outlines both my own personal process and the tools that I put into place. And there were many. I felt like I was throwing the kitchen sink at the problem, because it's uncomfortable to be in that place of uncertainty and not knowing where to go, especially when, I'm sure, like yourself, I mean, you're in uh, probably had to drive very hard for a long time. So to
Yes.
go from that speed and that, level of intensity and focus and all of that to stopping overnight is quite a big shift. For me, I found that some of the things that helped the most and that I included in the book, I mean, a lot of it was reflection. So I was journaling every day. I was using different questions and prompts. So there was that. I really leaned into a meditation practice. Something that I found too that was really helpful was I would kind of couple all these things together. And so a lot of the best insights that come, I mean, we all talk about it with even like innovation, where it's in the shower, or it's when I'm running, or, it's almost like you have to quiet the voice and
Mm.
let something bubble up. And it's that quieting process that's hard to do, especially when you're so hell bent on trying to figure out the answer. Okay, what am I going to do? Your brain wants to engage with it, and that's not always the best way to approach it. And so I found that I would sometimes, I'd plant questions before I went to bed just to get my subconscious working on things. I even, at times would even, try to understand what I was doing. What was I dreaming about? What was I, journaling, meditation, that sort of thing. And then I also was engaging in a lot of conversations with other people. So,
Hmm.
I'd have an idea about, well, maybe it's this. Okay, well, I better go talk to people who are doing that and understand more about what it's actually like. Because I've had a few of these diversions in life where I've tried something, and not, I think some amount of trial and error is absolutely just a part of the process. But
Yeah.
there are certainly aspects where you can try something that you maybe could have saved yourself time just with a couple of really pointed conversations with the right people.
Yeah, no
So
doubt.
I tried to do that as well.
Mike, how many books have you written?
3 books out there. So I've got the two you guys have mentioned, and then one that I co-authored with James Potter called The Successful Manager, which is about building and leading high-performing teams, really designed to be something for. Well, originally came about because we were looking to just be able to hand something to people who had maybe didn't have any management experience and just wanted an end-to-end all right, I'm brand new to this. Can you just give me a resource that helps me get a little bit more confident while I'm stepping into that role? But it's ended up being something that even I'd say, because it's sort of fundamental, that actually some more experienced people have actually found some value in too.
Mm. And I'm seeing uh, two of the books, the What's Your Calling and The Successful Manager, were both released in 2020. And then you've got your most recent one, Coach's Plan, in 2021. Seems like a pretty short period of time to be part of or write three books. Can you speak to what that experience is like?
Yeah, so well, I had to credit the third book, which I never really expected to write because I don't really think of myself as a productivity system kind of guy, at least not historically. But what happened for me was this recognition I had that led to the coach's plan system that I ended up putting into practice in my own life back in, I guess it was really early 2020. That was a huge part of what allowed me to get a lot of my own sort of self-defeating and bad habits and things out of the way and actually stick to the process of writing while trying to get the business and client work up and running. So I really credit a lot of it to the system, which I'm happy to talk about more if you guys want to go there now. Or
Yeah, would you? I'd love to know more. And if we could get into some of the nuts and bolts of like the to dos. So feel free to share, kind of I don't know if you have a number of steps or if you have a piece of the theory and then ground it into, for our listeners, what can they do with that today if they wanted to?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I'd say fundamental recognition I had, and it comes a little bit from the coaching work that I've done with people, which is that almost always when you think about what it is that's keeping you from, whatever it is that you want to achieve, you generally speaking actually know either everything that you need to do to get there or a lot of what you need to do to get there. And I often think, if you just look at, hey, if I did everything I know I should do to kind of be operating at my best, I'd basically be a superhero, right? I mean, we know, I should be eating this way. I should be getting enough sleep. I should be, the list goes on. There's all these things, but we don't, because we're human. And that gap is not a knowledge gap. Typically, it's more of an execution gap. And that the execution gap has like a lot of different causes to it. But what my own recognition was, and it kind of came to a head one night when I was sort of at a rut that I think any entrepreneur has been there, where you're just kind of, you're not in a good place. Maybe you're starting to feel the effects of burnout. You're just going through one of the emotional low points of the journey because maybe things are kind of hitting you. And in that moment, I was starting to have this internal dialogue with myself. Okay, well, what would you do if you were coaching yourself in this instance? And then dialogue kind of ensued, and all of a sudden, these very practical recommendations were coming out of, well, you should do this, you should do this, you should do this, and it was like, oh yeah, we all have this wisdom within. We all have this inner coach, and who knows what to do. The problem tends to be, though, that we are also the player who needs to show up on the field. And this is kind of the central metaphor of the book, which is you have a coach in you who's kind of setting the plan, making decisions, doing the higher order kind of thinking. You also have the player who's kind of the one that's got to show up and actually execute on things. And what happens is most of us kind of oscillate between the two. And so you might be going through your workday and you're wearing the coach hat one minute, and then the next minute you're supposed to be making those sales calls that you were making, and you're the player. And what invariably happens is we come to these points where we say, yeah, should I make the sales calls now, or should I do it later? Yeah, I don't really feel like doing it right now, so I'm going to do it later. Should I have a salad for lunch? Should I eat this thing I really want to eat for lunch? I think I'll skip the salad today. And in all of those different moments where what happens is basically we make decisions based on willpower, which is exhaustible, and the result is not so good. And so what my kind of core recognition was is if I could actually create some separation between these two roles, the inner coach and the player, and find a way to basically have the player show up and not question the coach's plan, but actually just execute the coach's plan, could I actually get some better results? And thus kind of ensued this whole system that happened, which I can go into more of the nuts and bolts of it, but it was essentially a system that had a few components, which is number one, I set a plan the night before usually. And number two, when the daytime rolls around, I'm following that plan to the letter, and that plan has some different components. And while I'm following that plan to the letter, I am also keeping track of what's working, what's not, essentially creating a feedback mechanism so that when the end of the day comes and it comes time for creating another plan, my plans are getting better. And not only when my plans are getting better, then my actual execution and follow through on the plans tend to be getting better as well. So that's kind of like the overarching framework to the coach's plan system. Obviously, there's then more that has to go into it because no plan survives first contact with the enemy, as you very quickly learn. So that's the system.
Thank you for that. So separating the coach and the player instead of commingling with confusion where the player within you can debate with the coach or outthink the coach, kind of bring your higher level of consciousness online the night before to create the plan, make a commitment, it'll be followed to the letter, and document what's working, what's not, to be able to practice continuous improvement. And you had alluded to there were some nuances within, but it does sound like it's a two-step plan. Plan the night before, do it the next day, and learn from that.
That's exactly it. I mean, that's the loop right there. And I think what happened was it's so simple. I mean, I remember when I first kind of put it out, I never had plans to share it. It was sort of my quirky thing that I was doing, and I'd be out walking with my wife, and we almost jokingly it became this thing where I'd say, nope, like it's not part of coach's plan, can't do it, and it became this mantra of just trust coach's plan. And then eventually one day I thought, this has worked really well for me, like surprisingly well for me. Maybe this is something that other people would find some value in. So I kind of set out, I decided to write the book. It's extremely short book. So it's something that, my intent was to have it be something that you genuinely could read in an hour. So it was like the equivalent of, the time and the expense of a cup of coffee. And, that would then increase the odds that somebody might actually take a chance on it and maybe run a little experiment in their life with it. And so I tossed it out there. I actually had no idea, how well was it going to resonate? Were people as wacky as I am in certain ways to kind of like embrace this sort of thing? And but it's turned out to be that the feedback has been really good. And I think actually a big part of it is even as simple and almost gimmicky as it might come across at first blush. The truth is most people aren't actually living this way. And the other aspect is that because of the feedback mechanism, the way that you implement coach's plan ends up looking different from the way that I implement coach's plan. And it does kind of become better as you go. It sort of adapts to both you as an individual as well as to your given circumstances at any given phase of your professional life, for example. And so I think that also is something that makes it just more likely to stick for people. So it's been a pleasant surprise. It's been something that I'm glad I ended up following through on because I wouldn't have expected it to be quite so to get quite the positive response that it did.
Well, now you had said decisions based on willpower don't hold because willpower is exhaustible. it sounds to me, and I'm sure I'm wrong, but if you could break it down for me, how is this not ultimately willpower to follow the coach's plan? So, a lot of people, me included, you go to bed at night and you think of what you want to commit to the next day. And sometimes you wake up and you follow it, and sometimes you fail yourself and you recommit to doing that again the next night. And there is a bit of that loop that goes on. It sounds to me like willpower is still part of the formula. Can you help with what's that transition to submitting to the coach within you look like that is not willpower alone?
Yeah. So it is. You're right that there is an aspect of willpower. I think the difference is that what. So I'll tell you what for me became kind of imbued it with the power that enabled me to actually stick with it. It was the fact that when I was creating this plan, and I almost advise for people, like the same way that you would normally start any new habit, and there's kind of like excitement and an extra dose of motivation in the beginning, which invariably wanes over time. And that's why February rolls around and all the people who signed up for the gym membership aren't going anymore. That acknowledge that that's going to happen. But what if you originally kind of give yourself to this notion that I'm not going to follow coaches, I'm not going to necessarily use coach's plan every single day. I'll just say for myself, I tend to, in most weeks, I might use it 3 days a week. So it's like 3 days a week where I'm going to be much more systematic, much more driven, much more structured. I have all my entire days basically scheduled out. I, follow it to the letter. And then there are these other days that are completely more free and unstructured. And I find that it's good to have both. And so I oscillate between the two. But on the days that I actually decide that I'm going to use coach's plan, because in the very beginning, I treated it almost like a contract with myself, and it was so powerful in allowing me to overcome some things that had actually been struggles for me for quite some time. Even for me, I had, a habit related thing. So I talk about it in the book. Sugar was something that was just, I'd gone off the rails with sugar. And it was something that for a very long time, I'm talking years, I had been like, I need to quit sugar. And I'd tried a couple of times for a week and, never really kind of stuck with it. And so that became part of coach's plan for me. So sugar, along with all the more like business oriented things that I mentioned earlier that I was struggling with. And what happened was, number one, like I started off and it was like, boom, oh my gosh, I'm having days that are just way better. It was night and day from where I was coming from at that kind of rut, the trough of the rut that I was in to where I was, but also seeing that it was helping me so much, even with things like this sugar habit, that it's like submitting to the plan then became, I didn't want to mess that up. I had essentially found something that was powerful, that it's like, oh, if you have it to the point where you can write something down on this plan and actually do it, that is something that 99% of the world does not have. So I don't want to mess this power up. I want to continue to imbue it with that power. And so I do that by cycling with it, not using it every single day, but it became a little bit organic because it was actually a preferable way or a more effective way for me to kind of get things done.
Yeah, Mike, I have a problem with this because I'd get benched a lot for not listening to the coach. And I do love, it'd be one thing for me on December 31st to say, this year, I'm going to eat healthy every day and I'm going to do this and this and this. And by the third day or fourth day, I'm eating potato chips. Like it's very easy to break that. What I love about what you're proposing is give yourself some room. It doesn't have to be every single day, but maybe you start with one day, maybe you start with 2, 3, 4, 5 days a week, whatever it may be. And the night before, commit to a plan and then commit to yourself that whatever you're going to do, you're just going to follow that plan that day. You don't have to do it the whole week, the whole month, the whole year. It's that day you're going to follow that plan and create that self-discipline. I really love that, and you talk about the execution gap. I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into that because everybody can sharpen the saw. We can read as many books as we want, listen to podcasts, whatever we do to sharpen the saw, do these conversations with people. And you're right. Like a lot of times deep down, we really know what to do. And a lot of times we hire consultants to come help us do, we kind of already know what to do. But we do that because somebody from out of town can probably tell us what to do better than we already know. Like I heard one point, the definition of an expert is just somebody from out of town. Because they can come in, I could probably provide you a lot of guidance. You can provide Rich a lot of guidance. Rich can provide me a lot of guidance just because we're somebody different. But then sometimes we have a hard time just taking it ourselves. Talk to me a little bit about, the commitment part of this. And you talked a lot about reflection, the meditation, the writing daily, the conversations, and the aspects you've taken that. So when you work with entrepreneurs, so, now beyond the books, I believe your business is really coaching, right? So if you're coaching someone to then coach themselves, how does that actually work? And what's your role in that relationship?
Well, I think for me, I found, and a lot of times, whether it's coaching one-on-one or it's also, I find it really interesting when you're coaching teams. And, a lot of times, like my favorite working environment is like, a leader of a function and their direct reports, as a unit.
Sure.
And, a lot of those, the issues, I think you're absolutely right that, people know they're what's going on to a certain extent. Sometimes there are actually important things that you don't see that are hidden beneath the surface. I fundamentally find that the role I end up playing is in part getting people in touch with what they already know. It's separating, it's helping people separate the signal from the noise. I think that's a big challenge that people have is we just have so much going on. There's so much noise and distraction, and every leader I've ever worked with is trying to accomplish too many things at once and lacks focus. And so a lot of it has to do with almost just guiding their own inner awakening around, all right, what can I shed in order to do these smaller set of things better? That's a big part of the role. And then I would say the third type of and of course this is all just kind of philosophical level type stuff, but the third level tends to be the things that we just don't see. And it goes back to what you said about, well, you could give me really good advice. Well, partly because I might not be able to see myself with the level of objectivity that you can see, so you can reflect things back to me.
Gotcha.
And so that can be, I mean, we're all familiar with when we're kind of, not able to do this for ourselves. I mean, I feel like I'm constantly going through periods where I get stuck, and, it's like a constant cycle. Every few months, I'm like, oh, I'm stuck again. Like, what is going on here? And, it's those times where you can get yourself out of there. Yeah, for sure. I absolutely think that ultimately you have to be the one to have that recognition, but it can be a whole lot faster and less painful when you have somebody else there to help you kind of come to that recognition and help you put it into practice. And that even more so, I think, on the teams level. That's part of why I like working with the teams, is there's often a lot of not necessarily unrecognized dynamics that get just almost become embedded, like you pour concrete, and it's like, oh, we just keep doing things the same way without recognizing that there might be another way. And having somebody come in from the outside to just ask you the right questions in the right ways, and get you to, and even sometimes just share examples of other people that have done things different ways, and all of a sudden you just start to see the wheels click, and that creates a spark that can create some momentum that they can then run with.
Yeah. So when you talk about setting a plan the day before, and then you talk just real quickly about working with teams, it seems like, in my head, when we were talking about this, and maybe because my mind was geared towards well-being and self-performance, it seems to me like the same concept could apply to business performance, not just personal performance, meaning what's my one thing that I'm going to do tomorrow, and focus on that one thing instead of opening up my email and my calendar and getting all, next thing the day's over and I didn't even know what I got accomplished that day, which tends to happen more than I'd like. Do these practices kind of apply not only to the well-being and self-performance, but also to the business practice and time management?
They definitely do. And what I find though is that the challenge tends to be that there's often barriers that you need to remove in order for that to happen. So like I'm very very keen on um, this dilemma of like if you're familiar with is Paul Graham wrote an essay, Maker Schedule, Manager Schedule, and he kind of highlights this distinction between people who are makers, whether you're an ideas person, you're an engineer, you're a coder, you're whatever it is, but you need these large blocks of dedicated time to kind of get into flow and to create and innovate. And that's like fundamental to business performance. And then you've got managers on the other hand who their whole way of being is essentially based around meeting with people. It's checking in, it's making sure that, and so they get these checkerboard calendars that are, just completely all over them. And what happens is like the default in most organizations of any size, really, but certainly gets worse the larger you get, is everybody's schedule defaults to being more like that prototypical manager schedule. It's fragmented. It is, I got this call and this meeting and this, and then I got 30 minutes and I'm going to try to check some email in that little 30 minutes. And it's not good both for well-being. I mean, it's kind of creates this fragmented, anxious state, but it's also not good for performance.
Yeah.
And so the challenge is like, and this is something I hear a lot with people who kind of, try to embrace coach's plan and then in the corporate environment and they put it into practice as one individual. They can, and they get some results for sure with that, but they're also subjected to, I mean, imagine a middle manager of a larger company who's, time is not their own and people are constantly dumping meetings on them that they have to be at, and they can't necessarily have the degree of control that they would want to. Well, you can really unlock a ton of performance if you can just get, even at the team level, everybody kind of on the same page, and you do little things. I mean, it could start with, it doesn't even have to be big, like we're going to do a no meeting Wednesday. It could be, we're just not going to have meetings on Wednesday from 8 to 11 a.m.
Yeah.
And that is time that everybody can use to, get stuff done or whatever the case may be. And these little things that you can start layering on can become actually, they almost like pack a punch way bigger than what they would seem, because they actually start to get people to question the way things are done.
Yes.
And even just have a more critical eye at what are all the ways in which we are actually draining and wasting precious time or energy, or trying to do too many things. It's like that reflective mechanism in the team starts to come online, and it becomes a overall self perpetuating beneficial type of cycle.
I would love to switch gears over to the successful manager.
Yeah.
Can you highlight a few key areas in that you feel like every entrepreneur with any size team could use or should be aware of?
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to start in maybe the least likely of places, which is one of the most common things that I come across is some form of imposter syndrome. So, especially if you're like a newer entrepreneur, you're new to the game. There's certainly a lot of people who their first leadership role is, I started this company. And that I comes with it almost like this process of where, you go in at first and think you don't know what you don't know. And then there's this period of rude awakening where it's a whole lot harder than you would expect it to be. And one of the challenges is, setting aside, certainly there are people who are kind of maybe default to being more confident or even bordering on, strong egos. but I actually find that more often than not, it's the opposite. It's that people uh, kind of feel like I don't have things as together as everybody else thinks that I have them together, or as I want them to think I have them together. And so for me, I would say one of the places that I like to start with people is just an acknowledgement that uh, almost everybody feels exactly that way,
Yep.
and just embrace it. It's not a bad thing that you feel that way. It's, by the way, not going away probably anytime soon. You're going to feel it because success begets new challenges and things, and so uh, accept it and start to make friends with it. And I think there's certain things that you can do as to basically make it not as bad, which I think comes down to things like uh, don't don't try to hide anything. If you don't know something, you don't have to pretend to be some. That actually creates more imposter syndrome.
Yes.
And so instead, lean into where you're strong and embrace, all right, I'm not good at this over here. I'm really confident over here. So I am going to rely more on other people, and I'm going to be very open about where my weaknesses are, or where I don't feel as confident, or where I'm not clear about a decision, but we need to make a decision anyway. That to me has been, it's one of the things that I wish more people knew, because it seems like it's an awakening every time people hear like, oh, wait, really? No way. I thought I was the only one that felt this extreme about my incompetence.
I have never thought, I've heard of the imposter syndrome, somewhat familiar with it, have had it myself at times, but I've never connected the dot between somebody trying to cover up their inadequacy increases the imposter syndrome because people don't really know what they're inadequate at, and it may beget them having to continue doing some acting.
Yeah.
And just putting on the table, hey, here's what I feel confident about. Here's what I'm not so confident about. I'm going to go into what I am confident in. Yeah, I never connected that dot. That's really interesting how you did that. So that's a starting place on the successful manager. Where would you go from there?
For me, a big area I go to is I think a huge part of the challenges that people face in management boils down to, and it's going to sound really basic, but communication and clarity. And that to me, I think if you can uh, lean in on establishing, take communication and awesome, amazing communication, whatever that means, and basically dissect it from every possible angle, and you uncover that there are so many layers to it. So, if you think about communication, it is, well, for starter, there's a million different forms of it. We're writing and emails, we're texting, we're having calls or conference calls, or this. So there's a million different forms of it. There's the actual, there's a frequency of it. There's the structures that we set up to make sure it's happening. There's the who, the audience. There's a million different ways that you can do it right, or do it not so well. And what what I see the most with teams, and I think it's very common in entrepreneurial spaces, because everybody's so stretched and needs to wear a ton of different hats. And there tends to be, it's not always the case, but there tends to be, I have to let people kind of run off and do their own thing and learn to kind of trust other people to get things done. There's often just not enough communication happening. And it feels like there isn't time to carve out for it. And so that to me, I would say, entrepreneurs are problem solvers. So take that same kind of, analytical or intuitive or whatever mindset you have that makes you effective at problem solving in the business space, and think about that as your problem, and say, how can I set up the right structures and improve my own communication, so that there just isn't the loss of information and the disconnects that tend to bubble up. And the longer they go unaddressed, the more severe the consequences can be to both, the business's performance, as well as just everybody's own sanity.
Yeah, Mike, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, I would say from people I've had that have managed me, and or managers I've had in firms that I've had, a big differentiator between those successful managers and those that weren't as successful, you could almost boil it always down to communication. Because communication leads to the relationship. Communication is also like, we had an episode in our past here on Entrepreneurs United with a guy named Michael Alasso, who's a communication specialist. And what he talks about is not so much the emails or whatever, but he talks about everything you do as a message, right? Your background is a message. If you're embracing your weaknesses in front of your team, that's a message to your team that you're vulnerable and you're willing to listen to them and learn from them. As an example, that's communication as well. So I love the fact that communication is a big piece of what's in that book, because it seems to me that's an area we can all get better at always. It's like a forever sharpening the saw of what you can do. Let's hit the last one. We talked about the coach's plan. We've talked about successful manager. What is your calling? And we shared earlier in this conversation, we each kind of went through a similar path, but I really want to know, what is that journey and that process that you found to find the work that you love? What are some of the key components of that?
Yeah. So for starters, I think the big message that I wanted to get across to people in that one, because it was something that I found that it just took me a lot of years to embrace about myself, and to not feel like I was kind of strange for caring as much about it as I did,
Yeah.
is that some people are wired so that in such a way that they need to have their livelihood be a real authentic expression of who they are.
Yeah.
It matters what they do. They need to feel a sense of purpose and passion about what they do. Not everybody's kind of wired to be able to just say, this is my day job, and and my nights and weekends are my time, and I'm okay with that kind of separation because this funds that, or however we think about it. And there's no one right to that, but it's just something that I think for a long time I stayed on a track that even past the point when I knew that it was time for a change, because it didn't feel quite as socially accepted.
Mm-hmm.
And it's especially can be the case if what you feel drawn to do is not necessarily something that's very easy to point to and say, all right, there's a clear path from point A to point B. And
Sure.
so what I wanted to do in that book was I kind of took the journey from end to end, starting from somebody who is completely clueless, like I was, of almost like I got a late start on it in life, to say, well, what is it that I really am all about? What do I want to make this next chapter of my life about? I don't know. So let me go through the process of actually trying to conjure that up. And we talked about some of the ways that you did that,
Yep.
and some of the ways that I did that. But then, okay, so you have an idea, and it's rarely going to be clear. You might just have a little piece of the puzzle, or just a sense of, I want to head in this direction. It's not always like, all right, I know that I want to be in this job, and therefore I need to go back to school, and here's the 5 steps I need to do to get there. And so even the kind of, how do I take one step when that's all I see in front of me, and the process of kind of being able to feel when things are right and when I may be going off course is
Yep.
is a tough one, as well as even just the leap itself. I mean, not everybody is graced with with the I'll say the good fortune of being forced out the door and forced into this process. And so a lot of people are stuck where they are, knowing that they kind of have something else in them that needs to get out there. But how? Should I do it on the side? Should I save up money? Should I, so
Sure.
that leap itself can be very challenging. And I actually found the thing that I did in my process, and it was a little bit, it happened a while back, but I started seeking out a bunch of people who had done this kind of thing. And they were at the time people who, and a lot of them were unusual careers. They were kind of artists. They were like, oh, I do a little bit of software development, and I'm a photographer, and this is my career and I love it. And so I was seeking out all these different people, and I found that just like being with those people and hearing their stories, I needed that as inspiration and motivation to make the jump myself, as well as to kind of stick with it. And so I included some profiles and stories of people in that book, who are just, ordinary, regular people like most of us who've gone through that journey, and who have, I believe, really compelling stories and amazing wisdom and learnings from their own journeys. And it's like, wow, if those stories are, all right around me, that didn't take me that far I didn't have to go that far to find these people. That must be everywhere. And if I got as much value out of that, not only can you get value just reading some of this in the book potentially, but it was almost like an encouragement to then say, go do the same thing. Go find your people and surround yourself with those people and learn from them, because that can really help give you the juice to move forward.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, it strikes me as we're having this conversation that not only can I benefit from having a coach's plan, so I would like to give that a shot for myself from a personal productivity and well-being. So I'll commit to that and report back to you, Mike, on how that works for me. But also even the successful manager piece of it, it strikes me that for a very easy, short read, which is what most people like these days, to provide those to new managers that start working for your organization, or really get promoted from a line role to a manager role, and say, hey, take this quick read, seems to be a really good investment for companies to make in their people. So I do know you have a website, Mike Kavanagh, MikeKav.com, where people can learn more. Is there anywhere or any other resources that our listeners can get more of yourself and your writings?
I think that's the best place to send people.
Okay, awesome. Well, we appreciate you coming on today. Thanks for all your messages and tools here. And we appreciate having you on the Entrepreneurs United podcast.
Well, thank you guys so much. I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Please stick around for a few more minutes while Rich and I break down this episode.
Rich, I'd love to take this challenge. I don't believe there's a template yet, although it'd be great. And something that I'd love for Mike to help us with in the future is a template. But I'd love to take a blank sheet of paper for at least 3 nights. And maybe we can start next week, 3 nights, and come up with a coach's plan for the following day regarding not business items, but our well-being and, performance. I think that I fall into this trap. I'm going to do this today. And then it's like, well, I'm tired. Well, my back hurts. Well, this bag of chips looks pretty good over here, or whatever it may be. And he's right. Like, if you think about it, we all know what we need to do to perform at our best, whether it be nutrition or how many hours you sleep, all the things that he mentioned. Yet our willpower kind of goes by the wayside a little bit. I love the idea of saying, no, this is the plan the coach came up with, and I'm going to follow it, and only for a day. I mean, anybody can do anything for a day. Come on. Like, there's no reason why you can't. And I love that being kind of a little bit of the foundation for new habits. I love it. I think it's so simple.
All right. I'm going to see your bet, and I'm going to raise you.
Okay. I'm in.
Here's the raise. I think we should have a little bit of accountability. And part of the reason why I'm suggesting this while we're recording is, if we have listeners who want to engage us, I'd recommend you have an accountability partner or have them listen to this episode.
Yep.
John, here's my recommendation. We take a picture of our plan and text it to each other. And then the next day it is, provide a check mark if you did it all, or suggest, what didn't work. Well, we should follow his plan, which is what's working, what's not. So, and it could be as long or as short as we want. I would recommend we have no minimum and no maximum. If we text each other every day, great. If it's only once in a week, great. And we'll have a couple of texts going back and forth that will remind us to do it for ourselves, and a little bit of accountability to do it. And why don't we do that for a week or two and just see how it goes?
I love it. Okay, done. So, one of the interesting things that we talked about in this conversation was the fundamental recognition piece that ultimately we know what to do. We may not just be doing it. I'm curious as to your thought process on that. I mean, it's no different for a company than it is an individual. And some of these tools are just so simple and so easy, but there's a psychological component behind them all. Whether it be procrastination or whether it be just, we don't want to do it, the willpower. What's behind all this psychologically? Like, how come we just don't just do it? Like, we know it's best for us. We know it's best for our family. Or we know it's best for our business. What's preventing us from it? What's behind that?
I don't know if I have the answer, but I certainly have an answer. And before I share that, I'll say it's known to be really common, right? That's why coaches hire a coach. That's why there's a phrase, taking your own medicine. Like it's known that people don't do what they espouse that others should do. It's my opinion that one of the reasons why that's the case is because as human beings, as creatures of habit, we tend to go to what is most comfortable and what is most enjoyable. Particularly in a lack of priorities and a lack of commitment, that's where we gravitate to. Yeah. And, you could track back millions of years to, caveman era, that you didn't need or want to expend energy that was unnecessary. So you took the route that expended as little energy as possible and as much pleasure as possible. And I find when I don't have higher consciousness, I do that with food. I do that with not exercising. I do that. And ultimately, sometimes I can get into a rut of living a life of comfort, but that's unfulfilling.
Yep.
And to bring I would use a phrase, bring the observer online. And it's interesting because he spoke to that when he said, it's hard to see yourself with a level of objectivity, which is exactly what having higher consciousness is your ability to observe your impulses and your behavior and be able to not defend them because they're yours, not defend them because it's ego-based, but to actually say, I see how what I was thinking there was not so good, or I see what I did there, that's actually not a good representation of my values. And to have that objectivity is really important. And I think we get caught in that. We don't have that objectivity, and we go to doing what's comfortable and doing as little as possible, honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting. He said, people have a hard time separating the signal from the noise, and guiding their inner awareness or guiding their inner awakening, he said, actually, of really what's going on. And it does drive to purpose, right? Like, how committed are you to a specific task or a specific purpose or a specific goal will probably get you so far. And certainly I have a lot of admiration for people that are just so committed to their task and their purpose that they just do not deviate. They're not on a coach's plan for a day. They're on a coach's plan for years. And they don't deviate from that plan. A lot of respect for people that have that discipline and that habit, because I feel like it's something that few have. It's very difficult to maintain. And maybe we take things for granted. Maybe things are too easy for us to fall off, whether it be our eating habits or, I don't have to work out today. We take things a little too easily. Which kind of goes back to the other piece. We didn't talk too much about it, but just like what is your calling? What is your journey? What are you trying to do? And how committed are you to those goals? Certainly Mike seems very committed to what he's done. To your point, like 3 books in like 2 years, immediately out of leaving corporate America. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think it's interesting because it's almost a testament to one of the books that he wrote on the coach's plan. The way that he got that done is every night, or at least 3 times a week, he made a commitment about what the next day was going to be about. And I bet you if we look back at those commitments, lots of those days were about writing.
No doubt. Yeah, just the commitment, the coach's plan that I'm going to write and document what I'm doing, I think is very important. And again, I guess the last piece for me is whether it be his coach's plan or whether it be his What Is Your Calling book or the Successful Manager book, all of them are fairly simple concepts, but they're great reminders that we really ultimately have an execution gap. We know what we need to do. We just don't necessarily do it. And I love the guidance that he's providing through these books to really get back on that execution plan.
Have you asked yourself that question? What would you do if you were coaching yourself? I know I have.
Yeah, I'd bench myself. I'd be like, this guy's not listening. I'm going to go find some new players.
If you find yourself in a bind and there's really nobody to turn to, or the person who you were going to call for advice, they don't happen to pick up the phone or they're not available, I'm sure you've asked, like, gosh, if I were asking me what I should do next, what would I tell that person? Or if it were someone else? And I just think that's so powerful, the idea of separating those two pieces of ourselves that he talked about, separate the coach from the player, and the belief that you have the wisdom within you. You know, any good coach does believe that the best answers are within the person, and it's really more about questioning to draw that out of them than it is having to tell them something new. It's more about asking questions about execution and their why.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I remember one of the first coaching classes I had ever taken, and it wasn't sports coaching, it was business coaching. And it was a class that they were giving to teach people how to be a better coach and supportive coach. And the whole conversation was, you know, if really your job as a coach is just to ask thought-provoking questions, because the answers are within that person. And how many times this has happened to me so many times where I'm having a conversation. It could even be with you, Rich, over the years. And I have an issue and we're talking through it and you're the coach and you ask me one or two questions and I kind of start feeling like an idiot. I'm like, yeah, I already know the answer. Thanks for getting it out of me, but I could have done this myself. But sometimes you just need someone to point things out, right? That you already know and they're already there. To answer your question, how I do it, I don't really ask myself that question, but maybe I should start asking myself that question. If I was coaching myself, what would I do here? What I typically do is it goes back to that blank sheet of paper. I usually write down what's going on in this blank sheet of paper, and I kind of think through it on that sheet of paper in terms of, okay, what are all the scenarios? What are all the different situations, and outcomes? That's kind of how I've coached myself a little bit. But it's the accountability piece of coaching that I think the coach's plan brings into question. Like it's like I could come up with a really good plan tonight for tomorrow, but is my accountability to the coach's plan there or not?
Yeah, I like that. And speaking of when you said, we could be talking about something, you'll ask a question, 2 questions later, you're like, yeah, thanks. I already knew that I could have done that. But what you, not just you, but anybody, what you didn't do is come up with a question that drew that out of you. And what I'm excited about trying this with you on using the coach's plan is that we take a time out to ask ourselves those questions that usually we would pay for a professional coach to do.
I like that.
Ask those questions. We're professional coaches. Now we get to take a 10 or 15 minute time out in the evening to ask ourselves those powerful questions and then have a bit of an accountability partner with each other to send the answers.
Love it.